watching Watercooler, a safe space for free thinking in which we shut out the din of daily politics and turn our minds to more important matters. Tonight we'll fire up the discussion on natural gas, one of the key elements of the federal government's future energy strategy. Energy Minister Angus Taylor will be joining me via Zoom from Goulburn to tell us why. Later we'll be taking another stroll across the minefield of transgender rights. 3 weeks ago on Watercooler, Senator Claire Chandler ventured her opinion of who should and who should not be allowed to participate in women's sport.
There is a 20 to 30% greater likelihood that a woman will be injured on the rugby field if she's tackled by a biological man. So it's a very complex area of life and of law that we need to work out. But my position is that women's sport needs to be preserved for biological women so that they can play on an even playing field and they know that they're safe when they're playing.
A fair point of view, you might think, but Senator Chandler is now facing a complaint from the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Commission for voicing her opinion. We'll be crossing to New York in search of some much-needed perspective on this issue. We'll be joined by Madeleine Kearns, who's been writing intelligently and I dare say courageously on transgenderism for the National Review. But first to energy and an instructive tale from my former home state of South Australia. Monday was the 4th anniversary of the Great South Australian Green-out, that fateful day when the state paid the price for their Labor government's radical renewable energy policy. Adelaide, as the story goes, beautiful one day, powerless the next. When the Northern Power Station was decommissioned in May 2016, the state lost almost a fifth of its energy generating capacity. 4 months later, September 28th, the state was plunged into darkness. South Australia serves as a crash test dummy for how the energy system needs to be adjusted as more and more wind and solar plugs into it. No state in Australia has adopted wind and solar so enthusiastically as South Australia. In fact, it's second only to Denmark when you measure it by the penetration of wind and solar. When the wind and solar are running at full bore, the state's got twice as much energy as it needs and it has to sell it off cheaply to other states. But when the sun goes down over the Spencer Gulf, solar generation disappears. And on a calm night, the wind drops off too. So what stops the lights going off every night in Adelaide? Is it Elon Musk's battery, the one that he presented with such great showmanship to a grateful, beleaguered Labor government? Not exactly. Let's look at where the energy came from last year in South Australia. Batteries contributed just 0.3%. Wind and solar provided just over half of SA's energy, intermittently, fitfully, when it felt like it. And when it didn't, well, natural gas provided 47%, firing up quickly to make up for the deficiencies, the lack of dispatchability in renewables. So the message is simple. The former Labor government's green ideology turned SA on a crash course. The state sustained some considerable damage along the way, but the key to putting stability back into the system was not batteries. The stability comes from putting the foot on the gas. Joining me to discuss the role of energy in Australia's Energy Minister, Angus Taylor. Thank you for your time, Angus.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
I think there's something we can do here which you probably don't get much of a chance to do on, say, the ABC in that sort of gotcha world that you encounter there. And that's actually talk about some of the technical and economic background to the policy settings that you announced last week. First of all, let's deal with gas. Now, I think there's two questions here. One is a technical question, one is an economic question. Why is it that gas is such a good technical solution now to our energy requirements?
Well, Nick, before I answer that question fully, let me just say that what we're talking about here is having balance in our energy system. Any energy system needs balance. It needs a mix of different fuel sources that can give it the reliability and affordability you need. And that's always been true. It's true right across the world. No one fuel source is the full answer. Now, having said that, there's an enormous opportunity to get more gas into our energy and industrial systems. And let me explain the two parts to that. First of all, on the electricity side, gas is flexible and it's dispatchable. So flexible, you can turn it on and off very, very quickly, and dispatchable, it's there when you need it. The energy is stored in the gas, and it means you've got access to that energy when you need it, as fast as you need it. Now, that's enormously important when you have fluctuations in demand, as you have in our energy system all the time. When people turn on their air conditioning or turn off their air conditioning, or heaters for that matter, you've got enormous fluctuations in demand. You have to be able to adjust to that. But we've also increasingly got fluctuations in supply because of solar, and household solar in particular. Record levels of investment in household solar. Lots of your viewers will have solar on their roofs, and that means we've got fluctuations in supply we've got to adjust to. Now, many fuel sources, coal in particular, can't adjust nearly as well to this as gas, and gas can. So it's a very, very important fuel source. On the industrial side, it's often misunderstood that a large proportion of the gas that we produce is not used for electricity. It's actually used as an industrial feedstock for really critical products like fertiliser, plastics, and a range of other goods that are essential. Bricks, other building materials that are absolutely essential to our lives. There are alternatives, but they're very, very expensive. So gas is great for manufacturing and industry. It's great for our energy system. We have great potential to get more of it into both our manufacturing and our energy system. But the key is to get it out of the ground and to make sure we've got an ample supply of it.
Yeah, I think the key to this, isn't it, is to understand that we're dealing with the energy problem we have now in 2020, not the energy problem that we had in 2010. And since then, of course, there's been a massive investment in renewables. I'm not sure that people always fully appreciate how big that is, because we're always being told by our critics that we're not doing enough on emissions. But it is massive, right? So in South Australia, for instance, I think they're second only to Denmark in terms of the amount of household solar per capita that they've put in. Now that's
we actually lead the world on this, and yet, I mean, to understand that, you just have to go into any suburb in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane in particular, and just look at the roofs and you'll see them there. Now, as I say, it's almost becoming ubiquitous. Now, that's partly because there were heavy subsidies. They're coming off, and we're, as a federal government, not adding any new subsidies. In fact, we're seeing them all coming off because we think the economics there shouldn't be subsidies. But still, people are investing, and it's understandable. It's a way of them reducing their energy bills. There's an enormous amount of advertising. So 1 in 4 households now in Australia has household solar, highest in the world. We've got to have complements to that. And gas is a very powerful complement to solar. It works well in that environment. We've always needed flexible fuel sources, by the way, and there were many blackouts in Sydney and Melbourne in the 50s and 60s, and in fact, Snowy 1 solved much of that problem. So you need flexibility in your energy system as alongside the baseload power. We'll need coal in our system as baseload for many years to come, but you need that flexibility. We haven't had enough of it, particularly in some states, particularly in South Australia indeed, and gas is a very, very good, affordable source of that flexibility.
Yeah, so let's get this clear. We claim to be energy source agnostic here. So if somebody came along to you tomorrow and said, look, I've got this fantastic plan for a new coal-fired power station that can, fill in some of this gap, and I've got finance for it, crucially, and I've got a state government backing it, you wouldn't say no to that, would you?
Sure. I mean, that's an interesting proposition. Obviously, subject to the costs, it's always going to be an interesting proposition. If they want to do it, go right ahead. I mean, the great challenge is finding a state government that would approve it. Getting finance, obviously, is a challenge as you laid out. But you also, the missing piece in our energy system at the moment is to have that flexibility. And that's why we need more gas generation. If Australia had the geography of Europe, you might say that there's more potential for a lot more hydro. We're doing some more hydro. but really, given our circumstances and our natural resource availability, that flexible dispatchable generation that we need so desperately is best achieved to a large degree by gas.
In the United States, of course, there's been a gas revolution with the technology of fracking, which has been introduced, and they've got, of course, very rich wet reserves, shale gas reserves there. Can we replicate that? Can we get to the position they are in the States at the moment, where the coal producers are just rolling over because gas is so much cheaper?
Well, you have seen a revolution in the United States, and it's in both the energy system and in manufacturing. And it has been driven by affordable supply of gas. There's no question about that. And Donald Trump has done well on the back of that. I mean, it's had a really significant impact pre-COVID on their manufacturing sector and on their energy system. And it has been gas driven. There's no question about that. Indeed, we've actually seen manufacturers shifting to the United States because of their affordable gas. Now, something remarkable has happened pre-COVID. It had already asserted itself back in January and February, and that's that Australian spot gas prices in the wholesale market have come into line with the United States. That is the first time we've seen that for many, many years. This is a very important development because it means we are now have access to an affordable source of gas at a market price, at an international price, which is extremely competitive. It's still hard to get longer term contracts, and many of the reforms we've announced in recent weeks have been about making sure that affordable gas that's available in the short term market becomes available over time for longer term contracts. But you can see the market is changing, and that's creating a great opportunity for Australia to take advantage of affordable gas.
So, 3 years ago when the Menzies Research Centre looked at the energy market, I think we got most things right, but we were saying at that point that there was an issue here because we were selling all our gas offshore at an international price, and yet we were not benefiting from any of that, staying onshore at a local price. Now, that seems to be sorting itself out in the market, right?
There's no question it is. There's some things we can do to strengthen that development, but we're seeing it happening in front of our eyes, Nick. And part of the reason for this, a very important part of the reason for this, is the United States has become a very fast growing exporter of liquefied natural gas, of gas. Its first export from outside of Alaska was in 2016. And in the last 3 years, it has crashed into the international market. It does mean the price in the United States is being set by the international price, but that's the international price we're also seeing. So relative to the United States, we are now in a very, very good position. It is a big change. It will take time for that to flow all the way through, but it means that affordable gas for our energy system to bring down the cost of electricity, or continue to bring it down. We're seeing really good movement on this now. And affordable gas for manufacturing is now a realistic prospect. And that challenge we had a few years back is dissipating. As I said, a number of reforms we're making to speed that along, but there are reforms that will speed along a natural market development that we already see in motion.
But at the end of the day, a shortage of supply of gas is always going to put pressure on prices, right? So we still have that in southeast Australia, in New South Wales and Victoria, where they've had moratorium in place, being lifted to various degrees in both states now. But that's created this shortage of gas in the southeast, which obviously is driving.
Let's be clear. It's a little more nuanced than that. So on the east coast of Australia, well, the west coast, we have massive excess of gas and we're a huge exporter. On the east coast, we have 3 times as much gas as we can use domestically, which is why we're a very significant exporter. Now, the truth is that much of that gas is coming out from Queensland. And Bass Strait, which was the traditional source of gas in the south, is running down. So it is true we're seeing more of a deficit emerging in the southern states, New South Wales and Victoria. That's why we want to see the moratoria gone in Victoria, and why we want to see Narrabri or other sources of gas in New South Wales coming forward, because we need southern gas as well as northern gas. We also need the capacity to transport gas from Queensland down into New South Wales to keep that price down, or New South Wales and Victoria. There is a pipeline to do it now, but it has to go all the way out to Moomba, so it has to go a long way west before it comes back into the east coast, the southeastern cities of Sydney and Melbourne. So there's a pipeline issue there. But, you know, the point here is, if we're smart about this, we can put downward pressure and ensure we have downward pressure on gas prices in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane. And as I say, a number of those reforms we've announced in recent weeks are about achieving that. The interesting thing is we made some pipeline reforms a couple of years back, which means we're seeing a price in Sydney and Melbourne at the moment, which is pretty much in line with the Queensland price. That, again, is a very new development because we've made the pipeline, access to pipelines more competitive. So we're moving rapidly down the track of making sure this all works, and that we've got Australian gas working for Australians, and that's what we have to do. But the market is on our side and the wind is in our sails.
Now, we're both fans of the free market, of course. We're both liberals in the traditional sense of the word. We would love it if we could just throw this whole mess that the energy market is out of the free market and allow them to fix it, right? But that's not going to happen. I don't think we've ever believed that would happen without at least some judicious and strategic government intervention. Is that your view too?
Well, yeah, look, there's two fundamental problems. One is there have been very significant interventions in energy markets in the past. The Labor governments raised a massive renewable energy target at the federal level, and they're driving through very rapid renewable energy targets in Victoria, in the ACT and in Queensland, and they're distorting the market. So very significant distortions there. The second distortion is that the market share of the top three players in electricity retail and electricity wholesaling generation in gas markets is very, very high. So small number of players with high market share. Economists call that an oligopoly. That's what we have in these energy markets. And so that again can cause distortions. If you lose a big slab of capacity like we did in Hazelwood in Victoria with the coal-fired power station, the incentive for the existing big players in the market to replace that capacity is low. And so we have to make sure the market is working for customers, for consumers. That's the whole purpose of a market, so that consumers get a good outcome. In a perfect world, and in many markets, you just let it run and consumers are looked after. It's in the interest of suppliers to do that. But when you have very significant market distortions, you don't necessarily. And that's where we've had to make interventions, and we'll continue to have to make them. We make as little in the way of interventions as we possibly can. But this is an essential service. Energy is a utility for all Australians, as well as for critical manufacturing industries and other industries like transport and agriculture. And so, we need a fair deal, and we need to make sure those distortions are not hurting customers.
One thing I think we need to deal with if we're going to unpack this issue, and that's the timing issue. I think a lot of people, they look at what we're reading on the future of nuclear and the fourth generation nuclear, and they think that's very good. People look at hydrogen. But I think the crucial point is here, although they are promising technologies, they're not ready yet, and certainly not on the time scale that we need, right? We've got an urgent issue here.
Look, there are views out there that suggest that if you just announce some whiz-bang new project or technology, then suddenly the electricity price will collapse. It's just not true. The energy price will collapse. It's just not true. I mean, this is hard slog of getting more supply into the system whilst we make sure that other supply is not leaving the system and that our prices reflect a competitive market. That is hard slog. Now it's working. This is the point I'd make. In the last 12 months, we've seen wholesale electricity prices fall every month relative to the same time last year. It's a seasonal market, so you judge it against the same time in the previous year. Every month, we saw 4 consecutive quarters of CPI reductions in electricity prices. So that's a good start. We've got further to go. We've got to make sure those wholesale price reductions pass through to customers. But if we keep seeing supply coming in, avoiding large losses of supply, say a big electricity generator leaving the market, or states doing crazy things with moratoria on gas, we'll continue to see this downward pressure, and that then gives customers what they need, which is a fair deal, reliable, affordable energy, and gives manufacturers what they need, which is access to a supply of energy which is affordable and which they can trust, on the back of which they can make big investments.
And one part of your speech to the National Press Club last week, which I think didn't get much attention at all, was one of your key technology developments you talked about was the ability to measure carbon in soil and therefore to use farming in a much more effective way in terms of carbon mitigation. But of course that also has lots of other effects. Tell us about that.
Well, this is one of the 5 priority technologies where we said we want to put more research and development effort. And the great thing about soil carbon is, yes, we can store more carbon in our soil, but actually in the process of doing that to a sensible level, we can raise the productivity of agriculture in Australia. And we've had an aspiration as a government of getting agriculture to be a $100 billion industry. We've been making good progress on that. But productivity of our soils and output of our pastures and crops is key to achieving that outcome. Now, it turns out, and it's sort of obvious when you think about it, when you grow more in your soil, you're producing more organic matter, which is carbon, and more carbon ends up staying in the soil. Yes, some of the carbon is taken off through harvest and through animals, sheep and cattle eating that grass, but some of it stays. And so if you can produce more from your land, you can store more carbon, and vice versa. Storing more carbon helps you to produce more. So it becomes this virtuous cycle. So there is a great opportunity to improve the productivity of our agriculture, store carbon while we're at it. What do we have to do that? Well, there's many different ways of increasing productivity on land. I mean, nutrients in soil is a very natural part of what farmers have done for many years, and there's new developments there. There's better pasture types, better seed types, and a range of other practices that have emerged using satellite technology to better understand how you should graze your country. All of these things are contributing to the opportunity for significant productivity gains, and in the process, increasing our soil carbon. Now, the great challenge with all of this is how to measure how much carbon you've got in your soil. We can do that now. We dig a big, deep hole, 1 metre deep, and pull out a core sample and go and get that tested at the lab. CSIRO has done unbelievable work in bringing down the cost of doing all of that. But there are other techniques for measuring soil carbon which are now becoming possible. Using satellite technology is one area where we think there's enormous potential. We want to get that cost right down so farmers know exactly where they sit, what their land is producing, doing and measuring that at very low cost, and in the process understanding better what practices are working and what aren't.
Yeah, so with the Menzies Research Centre, we're just finalising a report. I think we've spoken about it before on exactly this topic. And it seems to me that the key thing is a lot of good farmers are doing this already. A lot of smart farmers have realised that for a relatively small investment, you can considerably increase the productivity. Of course, water retention, which is important in the drought. But it seems to me they need to be rewarded for this too. If they're putting carbon in the soil, then they deserve to benefit from that, right?
Well, this is the point. There are many other things that we're now doing across the economy where people are being rewarded for reducing emissions. Indeed, the electricity grid, we've seen exactly that with schemes that have been put in place. But our emissions reduction fund has always been about creating a modest, not a huge incentive, but a really real and incentive for farmers and others to reduce emissions. The key with all of this is to be able to measure it, and that's why we're investing in the measurement technology so we can better ascertain how farmers are doing on this. And in the process of measuring it well, we're in a position then where we can pay them for the important role they're playing in doing all of this. So, we lead the world in this area. And there's a number of other technologies where we lead the world. And we shouldn't be surprised about that. Our farmers have led the world in so many areas for centuries now. We've been extraordinarily innovative. Massive gains in labour productivity and the use of shearing machines, the stump jump plough, many of the crop varieties that we've developed here in Australia, often through CSIRO over the years. This is another area where we know we can lead the world, and we should be doing that. It will be good for our agriculture, and it will also be good for bringing down emissions while we're at it. I love any opportunity that can do both of these things. We don't have to worry about the trade-off then. We are encouraging sensible practices that are good for people's businesses and good for the country.
We might just go back briefly before we wrap up and look at the last election. One of the big issues, in fact, I think, possibly the decisive issue in that election was climate policy. Labor thought it was going to win with its very showy 35% emissions reduction target by 2050 or 2030. Sorry, but you argued, and I think with the help of the work that Dr. Brian Fisher did, and I think some of the work we did, that was crazy, and you won that argument essentially. And the proof is that Labor is now backed right away from that policy. They don't even have an emissions target for 2030, do they?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, look, the worst thing in the world in this area is to have a large target without a plan to get there, because what you then have to do is impose a whole lot of costs on people to achieve that target. Now, there's only two ways to reduce emissions. You use technologies in sensible ways where those technologies are coming into line with alternatives that don't impose economic costs, because it's just sensible for that business or that household to use the technology. And I mean, talking about some of those farming practices, deploying those farming practices is not going to make agriculture less competitive, it'll make it more competitive. So they're the sort of technologies that we want to deploy. The alternative, if you set very aggressive targets, is you've got to just start curbing activity, stopping activity to reach those targets. Now, that's effectively the target, the scale of the target that Labor had going into the last election. We know that their targets from the modelling Brian Fisher did would have cost 336,000 jobs across a range of different industries, slashed wages, slashed the economy, raised the price of electricity and gas for all Australians, and Labor weren't fessing up. Now, we made that apparent through Brian Fisher's work, and it was a very, very, very good piece of work in actually fleshing this out. Labor didn't have answers to any of the questions, and now, not surprisingly, they're backing away from the policy. The result is they have no 2030 target at all. They obviously have no plan to get there because there's no target in the first place. And they seem to be tearing each other apart on these issues. So, look, this all did begin at the last election, but the moral of the story is if you're going to have an emissions reduction target, make it a sensible one and make sure you can achieve it in ways that don't damage the economy, damage jobs, and raise the price of energy.
I'll close by just quoting to something the commentator wrote in one of the Fairfax papers at the weekend. I don't think naturally a supporter. He said that he was reflecting on the fact generally that under the Morrison government there seems to be a more consensual approach within the party and less hopefully there's always dispute and argument. We want that in a party, don't we? But let's hopefully there's a little bit less. But he said even in the quagmire of energy policy, nothing is quite the tinderbox that same-sex marriage used to be. Are you getting somewhere close to getting consensus within the party around these policies?
Well, I think all Liberals, all on this, our side of politics, Nick, believe strongly in the power of progress and technology, what it gave us through the Industrial Revolution and since in terms of prosperity, opportunity, aspiration. I mean, we've harnessed technology to help us over the years. And what I'm proposing and what the government's proposing is that we should do the same to bring down emissions, but more importantly, or as importantly, to strengthen the competitiveness of critical industries, of our manufacturing industry, of our transport industry, of our agricultural sector in the process. And we can do that because we do lead the world in critical energy intensive technologies. We've been an exporter of energy intensive products for a long, long time. So we're extremely well positioned to do this. We should take advantage of it. And the result of that is we can all embrace it, whichever side whichever part of the party you're from, this is good for the economy, good for aspiration, good for opportunity, good for competitiveness, and it aligns with the sort of values we really believe in.
Well, Angus, thank you for your time and thank you for bringing a bit of clarity to this often cloudy and opaque policy area. And congratulations on on your new policy.
Thank you, Nick.
Well, we'll be having a lot more to say about gas in coming weeks when we publish the report I mentioned earlier, Powering Away from Pandemic. And we'll also be looking at the issue of soil carbon, soil management, productivity and farming in a report we'll be publishing together with the Page Research Centre from the grassroots up. But now to a topic we touched on 3 weeks ago in a discussion with Senator Claire Chandler that appears to have generated quite a bit of controversy. The rise of transgender activism, amplified through the medium of Twitter, has turned any kind of discussion about gender into a minefield. Author J.K. Rowling is now being accused of writing a transphobic novel after she insisted on making a distinction between biological women and transgendered biological men. In a public policy think tank like this, it's tempting to steer well clear of this fractious debate. But we can't. The transgender ideology is having an impact on public policy, whether we like it or not, and on the right to free speech. Senator Chandler now finds herself answering a complaint from Equal Opportunity Tasmania for voicing her opinion. The complaint's utterly fallacious, of course, but these things end up taking chunks out of your day that a senator should be spending on matters relevant to the future of the country and their community. The long and the short of it is that as public policy makers, we need to get a handle on the moral complexities of these discussions or risk conceding ground to the illiberal forces who choose to turn issues of sexual identity into political battering rams. Madeleine Kearns is a staff writer at the National Review who's contributed some intelligent and courageous thought on this topic. She joins me from New York. Madeleine, thank you for joining me and welcome to Watercooler.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be here.
You've been writing, I think, some very brave pieces on transgenderism and the issues around that. And you know, I know that's a very difficult thing to write about. I mean, or even comment about when you look at J.K. Rowling. What do you think of J.K. Rowling's experience, first of all?
I think that it's funny. So I'm stealing analysis here from my colleague Jay Nordlinger, where he says, you know, it's very easy for people to say, oh well, that person has loads of money, so it's not actually brave for them to take a stand. But actually, there's much more to life than money, and there's much more to human relationships than money. And I think the fact that this is somebody who has built up a reputation and has been just so loved and admired by liberals and progressives, and very much one of them. I mean, if you look at her views on all sorts of things, she knew what she was doing when she got involved in this fight. And she did so anyway. And I think that genuinely is quite brave, and I really admire her for it. She could have just sat this one out. She could have just said, you know what, I'll just from the sideline and see what's going on. But she said, no, actually, this is a totally reasonable and defensible position. And she actually originally weighed into this on Twitter in defense of a woman who'd been fired, who'd lost her job, for saying completely reasonable, common sense things on Twitter about, you know, biological sex. And she said, look, I think it's not fair for people to be fired for this reason. So I'm just very admiring of her, and very appreciative of her signaling that actually this position can be perfectly mainstream. So I do think that I've almost turned into, like, every time one of these things happens, I'll like write another piece explaining why no, actually J.K. Rowling is not a transphobe. I mean, I don't know how many times I'll keep saying this, but they just won't give up. They just keep going for her head. I mean, the latest controversy I'm sure you saw was about her new crime novel that she published under her male pseudonym, which is kind of ironic actually in a sense. But she published this crime novel, and everybody One reviewer at the Daily Telegraph suggested that a character who had one page of this 900-page novel, in one page, in one paragraph, puts on a woman's coat and wig, that this was a transvestite serial killer. And the moral of the story, this 900-page story, was clearly that you could never trust a man in a dress. No man in a dress in the book, by the way, as Nick Cohen at The Spectator pointed out. But in any case, this gets picked up by the LGBTQ plus propaganda website, Pink News. And then this starts this big uproar on Twitter. And then you have these sort of middling celebrities of middling talent weighing in, like Jedward, who once appeared on X Factor in like 2012 or something, and evidently share a brain as well as a name, saying things to her, saying things that we should burn J.K. Rowling's books. We should burn them, because how progressive is that, really?
Yeah, look, we're obliged to say, even though they won't listen to us, we're obliged to say at this point that we are not transphobes. Neither you nor I suspect. That we have friends who are, have transgendered. I've interviewed a very brilliant transgendered woman on this podcast not so long ago. So let's put that one to bed, if you like. So what is the problem here? I mean, what is it? Why is it that we find ourselves on the unpopular side of this argument, if you like?
Well, it's very simple. It's that there's a point at which you're right to do what you please with your own body and so on and so forth. It cannot cross the line into demanding that other people say things that they do not believe to be true and which are clearly not true. And so the problem is that you talk about the transgender people who are in no way extreme, and it is important to differentiate between the activists and the people they purport to represent. That is true. But what the activists are saying has to be met with determined opposition. What the activists are saying is that you can literally change your biological sex. You can literally change it. In fact, they're saying two contradictory things at once. You can literally change your biological sex, but not only that, your gender identity, your inner sense, your soul, if you will, determines what sex you already are. So you already are the sex you think you are, but you can change your body to match that sex. They use this language, it's very confusing, it's very convoluted, that you're assigned a sex at birth, and then after you are assigned this sex at birth by some whimsical god or careless doctor, and it turns out it was a mistake, that you can then override this with your gender identity. And actually, if you don't even want to change your body, if you don't even want to change it, you don't have to, but you still need to be recognized for this inner sense that you have. So if you felt that you were transgender and you now want to be treated as a woman, you wouldn't even need to really put on a dress or do anything. And so the problem becomes, well, if somebody claims that they're a woman, do we in law and in life accommodate that belief? Well, no, actually we don't. Now, of course, there's a distinction to be made here. If the point is that somebody is deeply unhappy and uncomfortable with their sex and would rather present as the opposite sex because psychologically that alleviates some of that suffering, okay, that's one thing. And that is actually how transgender people just were part of society before this became a big, huge thing, right? Was that it was worked out in relationships of mutual trust and respect, and you maybe if you're in the bathroom, you're washing your hands, you kind of double take because based on facial structure and all the rest of it, generally like 99% of the time you know if somebody's a man or a woman just by looking at them. You maybe double take, and if you do this internal risk assessment as a woman, you think actually no, this person seems fine, just hello, how are you, yes, be polite, and you get on with your day. Now, when that was happening, when transgenders and transsexualism first became a possibility, you would kind of assume at that point that that person had had surgery and that person had had hormones and all the rest of it. But the transgender umbrella is now so wide that it could cover, as I said before, somebody like yourself, who is just a man in man's clothing, who claims some identity and has to use the bathroom of his choosing. This is obviously not acceptable, to mandate and give away the rights of women and say that that person has a right to be there, and that no person is allowed to say, I'm sorry, it's actually, I feel uncomfortable. You know, and so actually what it's done, this relentless aggressive push has actually harmed the relationship that trans people had with society, okay, because it's turned it into this big issue and it's made women really angry. And by saying that the top down, you want to take away their rights, it's made them say, well, no, I don't want anybody. I don't want any man in my bathroom. I don't want any man, you know, claiming that he has a right to be in my women's team, club, whatever, you know. And unfortunately, that's done a great deal of harm to everyone. It's really upset the whole balance. So it's just, and the point I just have to keep returning to it is it's just that it's based on something that's not true, and it's based on something that's obviously not true. The whole point, and when this started, was that people had surgeries and hormones and wore clothing to alleviate very complicated psychological trauma. And that they should be accommodated insofar as it's reasonable. Okay, I'm totally fine with that. I'm totally on board with that. But the insofar as it is reasonable and the accommodated while they present as the opposite sex is not what's being advocated. What they're saying is these people are the sex and they have to be accommodated, because anything less than accommodating them is an erasure of their existence, and is not only that, is possibly contributing to widespread suicide.
Let's talk about how this spills out into the political arena. So here in Australia, Senator Claire Chandler in Tasmania has made a speech the other week in the Senate to say that women's sport should be preserved for biological women. And there's very good reason for that. There are studies that show that, particularly in contact sports like rugby, for instance, or even soccer, women are far more likely to be injured if they're playing against a biological man. I choose my words carefully. Somebody criticised me the other week, called me insensitive for talking about a transgendered biological man. I don't quite know how I'm supposed to describe it, but it does show the sensitivity around this. But on that issue of women's sport, so what happened was, the Green Party in the Senate, of course, condemned Senator Chandler for her gross prejudice and insensitivity and so forth. The Labour Party on the centre left were just pretty much silent on it. And I think this is what's happening, isn't it? There's this great silence from people who consider themselves on the left particularly, who would like to speak out about it, but feel that they'll upset part of their constituency, a bit like possibly what's happening in Scotland. What do you think?
Yeah, so first of all, I actually want to pick you up on something you said about sensitivity and language. I think there's a very clear line to be drawn here. When you're having a political discussion, which is what we're having, then you have to use accurate and precise terminology. When you're having a interpersonal conversation, then you resort to good manners. So if I were talking to a person who was transgender, I would obviously use the pronouns, unless this was in the context of political debate. I would obviously use the pronouns and refer to them as they wish, because that's the polite thing to do. But if you're having a conversation about what this actually comes down to, you have to use the language that best serves your argument. So I am at the point now. At first, when I waded into this minefield, I was very, very careful. I did the biological man or the male and the whatever. And now I'm like, no, I'm sorry. I actually can't do that, because it doesn't serve my argument. I'll give you an analogy of why I think this is an important point. Can you imagine if there's a Christian and an atheist and they want to debate the existence of God, but that the atheist demands that throughout the entire debate, the Christian refers to him and all other atheists or all other Christians as children of God? Well, he would have to say, no, I'm sorry, I actually can't do that. Because if I do that, then I've already lost the debate before we even had it. So this is the problem, is that it comes down, the absolute nub of the issue is that you can't, my position, I don't dare to presume what yours is, but my position is you cannot become the opposite sex, and you are not the opposite sex because you feel that you are. Materially, physically, biologically, that's just the truth. That's as I think it's actually a fairly obvious truth, because like what's more likely that your sex is determined at birth and observed, or that there's this mysterious gendered soul through some process of Cartesian dualism where there's a soul split with the body, that the soul then supersedes the body and determines what you truly really are, and we're all supposed to just take your word for it. I mean, come on, that's just we're living in 2020. We don't believe in superstitions like that. I mean, you're free to, you know. So yeah. I think that the language thing is how they've done it. The language thing is they have used and exploited the fact that most people, most liberally minded people, myself included, the small L liberal, most liberally minded people don't want to offend people, don't want to upset people, don't want to hurt people, and are perfectly happy for people to live according to their superstitions or whatever makes them happy. That's fine. That's fine. So what they do is they suggest that if you, in arguing your point, your political point, use language that precisely gets to the point of what you're trying to argue for or against, you are being hateful and you ought to shut up and you ought to talk as we talk, or you should really not be part of this debate. And I have a really serious problem with that.
Look, I think what you say about language is very interesting. So what you're suggesting is if we, as you naturally do, are you offended by that word? Okay, I'll use another. Are there any words? But in doing that, we actually ceding ground gradually in the debate. Is that what's occurring?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. In fact, this actually came up for me. I made a decision with actually an individual, a transgender individual who I'm saying individual, not representative of all trans people, not representative of anyone other than this individual. And this individual was such an obvious bad actor. This individual was a bully and a cheat and a liar and so many other things. I'm not going to say who it is because I don't want to get into legal trouble. But the point is, this individual, I just thought, you know what? I believe this person is a man, and I think it is directly relevant to the argument that this person is a man. Because if the people at home knew and could see clearly and straightforwardly that this is a man, they would be horrified and think, I can't believe that man's treating women like that. That's not acceptable, you know? And actually, the thing is, fundamentally, I believe that transgender women are men who do not like being men. And I am happy on a case-by-case basis individually to completely accommodate that and avoid as much as I can calling them men, because that's upsetting. But in the context of a political argument, it is really important that I am as precise as I can be. And it's all the more important now that people are taking away your right to do that. People are being fired for saying what I just said. Lots of people would be fired. It would be considered this great blasphemy. Well, I'm sorry, but let's go back to my analogy. If the atheist cannot say, I don't believe you're a child of God, I believe you're a creature of evolution. If the atheist cannot say, I don't believe God exists, then you're not even having a debate. You're poking around the edges. You're gently tiptoeing and trying not to offend anyone, and maybe say, oh, well, maybe we're going a bit far here. Maybe we're, no, like that's not how a debate should work. And regardless of your personal lived experience and all the rest of it, if you can't stand the heat, get out the kitchen. If you don't want to have the debate in frank terms because it offends you personally, you're not really the best person to be advocating your position. Because I cannot think of any other context in which like somebody would be having a debate with someone and they would say, well, actually, it personally offends me that you would say that. So,
having ignited one Twitter storm, let's try and ignite another one. Universities, I'm interested in your experience of universities, what's happening to them. in America, the sense that there's a return to segregation, which, you know, was real in my lifetime. We thought we got rid of it forever. Talk on that subject.
Sure. So universities are full of young people, and young people are very confident and sure of what they think and don't really have very much experience. And so this is not a very good combination for generating ideas, actually. And so normally what the idea of a university was, you would go with your cocksure opinions and things about the world and all the rest of it, and you would meet people of different backgrounds and different viewpoints and different worldviews, and you would grow into a more open-minded person, a more well-adjusted person, a person perhaps who is more prone to heterodoxy, at least to entertaining and seriously engaging with alternative views. Unfortunately, that's not what happens anymore. You go to campus and there's this huge pressure to conform to certain orthodoxies related to gender, race, identity. And if you don't conform to them, then you are assumed to be a bigot, a terrible, awful person. And, you know, the other thing about young people is not only are they prone to be very sure of their beliefs, they're prone to like really, really care about what other people think of them. And so many adopt causes, and the causes are the causes of the age. So these are anti-racism and anti-transphobia and gay rights and so on and so forth. All very fine and noble causes, but because they've never actually met somebody who even slightly disagrees with them on any of these points, you know, I mean, I'm thinking of Coleman Hughes, who's now at the Manhattan Institute, who is himself a person of color, okay, who just disagrees with the way that you interpret racism and the way that you solve it. So, you know, he doesn't buy into critical race theory, for instance. Well, they've never met somebody like Coleman Hughes. And so when somebody like Coleman Hughes, either Coleman himself or somebody maybe who's not Black, suggests that actually, I don't think that the country is intrinsically racist. I think that what's going on here is X, Y, or Z. There's this massive reaction because they think that this person is the monster that they've been looking for their whole lives, that this monster, this horrible, evil bigot, and they just go nuclear. And it's very sad. It's very sad because it's just the complete opposite of what a university education is supposed to do, and it doesn't solve anything.
So I can't let you go, of course, without asking you about the election, the forthcoming election in the United States. You're in New York. I guess everybody there around you is probably predicting a Biden victory. But what's your thoughts?
Well, you know, I always avoid, well, as much as I can, I avoid speculation. But it does kind of look, if you're a polls guy or polls gal, then it does look like Biden's on track to win. The two things that caution me from being reading too much into that is, first of all, that what were the polls saying in 2016, right? But then the second thing, of course, and that accounts for, you know, Trump voters tend to have higher voter enthusiasm, and whereas like with Biden, people were voting, with Hillary, people were voting more like against Trump, and it's a similar thing with Biden when you look at voting enthusiasm. But the second thing is, I think that the Democrats have made a strategic mistake on law and order in a lot of places. Now, Biden himself has been quite sensible in avoiding directly endorsing the more radical elements of the Black Lives Matter movement, sort of defunding the police and so on. But I think there's a general sense of really quite strong dissatisfaction across America with Democratic leadership in cities where crime is just going through the roof. And there was a similar thing with obviously Nixon in 1968 with the law and order thing, and there was a miscalculation. The progressives miscalculated the public mood and public atmosphere, and by the time of the election, people were they'd had enough. Really, they'd had enough of this nonsense. So I think that were it not for that, then it would be quite likely a Biden win. But I think, given that, I'm not actually so sure. I think it could go either way.
Well, thanks very much, Maddie, for your conversation today, and thanks for everything you write in National Review, in Spectator, and elsewhere. And be good to have you back on Watercooler again sometime.
Sure, sounds great. Thanks for having me.